is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nigel Farage.
Prime Minister May has been accused by Labour and the trade unions of watering down her plans to tackle corporate excesses. Under her reforms, the UK's biggest firms will have to reveal how much more money their chief execs earn compared to average workers. Also, she is encouraging workers to be represented on boards. But whatever Labour say about this being feeble, does there need to be a debate about a fundamental reform of business corporate pay in the UK? And if so, whose responsibility is it to change things, the government's or shareholders? Well, I've wondered right from the start, because it was very interesting that Theresa May is a Conservative, and yet, in the Tory manifesto, she wanted to be very interventionist about the amount of money that chief executives are paid. When it comes to it, she has said today that workers need to have voices on boards, and that there must be full declaration of what chief execs earn, and that she'll encourage shareholders to perhaps become more active. So what is really going on out there? Well, it's what I call the modern corporate world. To me, it's a long way away from what genuine free market capitalism ought to be. And I just wonder, when David Cameron became Prime Minister, the average chief exec earned 145 times what the average factory worker earned. By 2020, it's going to be 214 times that amount. So I'm Nigel Farage. Yes, it's a different voice. Ian Dale's away on holiday, and I'm going to be doing the drive show from 4 till 7 every day between now and Friday. Ian has let me loose with his listeners, which is very brave of him in many ways. So this is the first topic we're going to discuss. Is it right for government to intervene? Could government perhaps, and remember that the European Union already have set limits on what companies may pay individuals in terms of bonuses. Is it right for government to intervene, or does that lead, in the end, to a form of statism that means in the end government tells us what the price of a loaf of bread should be? Or should it be up to shareholders to deal with this kind of thing? And is there some evidence that in fact over the last couple of years shareholders have become more active? They don't mind chief execs who are paying big dividends and doing well, earning big money, but maybe a few have been freeloading. And to help me through this difficult topic is a man who knows his way round the odd corporate boardroom or two. It's David Buick, market analyst for Panmure Gordon. David, good afternoon.
And good afternoon to you, Nigel.
So we've got a Tory government here who, in many ways, David, are being interventionist. But is the Prime Minister right to put a finger on a problem that actually those at the top get paid more and more and more compared to the average worker?
Nigel, we don't want sound bites, which is what we're getting. You cannot compare apples with pears. And to come out with chief executives earning, whether it's 140 times or 220 times what the average worker works, it sounds dreadful, but you've got to put the thing in context. Shareholders for so many years have abrogated their responsibilities, and when excessive pay awards have been put up before the board, occasionally used to get the odd objection, but it was always waved through. These people have serious stakes in these companies, and they have to make their thoughts very clear on the subject. Secondly, there's a huge difference, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, because you and I both worked in smaller companies numerically. I don't mean, people. You and I have never worked with people who've got thousands and thousands of employees. It's been a business in both of our cases that's been driven on profitability, and you get paid accordingly. But you cannot pay entrepreneurs under the same basis as you pay managers. For instance, let me just draw an analogy which will bring howls of mirth and grief from your listeners. Sir Martin Sorrell, he's been at
We've lost David Buick, who was about to tell us about corporate excess. Well, we're going to get David Buick back on the line. ISDN just crashed on us. David was making the point there that the big shareholders have big stakes in these companies, and that they would not allow duds to get overpaid. And remember, this conversation, folks, you're driving home from work or wherever you are, and why are they talking about the City and the FTSE 100? It doesn't affect me. Do you know something? It affects every single one of you, because every single one of you that's put any money aside into a pension fund is invested in these companies. So it's in all of our interests that this balance be got right. I'm going to go to Sam in Aberdeen whilst we hunt David Buick down. Sam, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Well, I'm all right, but I'm sort of puzzled because I've always considered myself, Sam, to be a believer in capitalism. I'm not sure these days we've actually got it. I think we've got sort of corporatism. I do worry, and I was being ticked off there by David Buick for talking in sound bites by saying that, you know, the average salary of bosses was going up exponentially. But I feel, Sam, I mean, my own view is government shouldn't meddle in what people get paid. I think that's a mistake. But I personally think...
I absolutely agree with you. But agree with you more.
But I just think once government starts to mess around with these things, it generally makes an absolute mess of it. But I do think that there is a strong argument for genuine shareholder activism at AGMs if people are being paid too much money for frankly being duds. That's my view, Sam. What do you think?
Well, I think the problem is with entrusting the government to have any kind of input in this is first we have to have some kind of trust in the government. So without that, we're not even off the starting blocks. So
now that, Sam, could take quite a long time, couldn't it?
I mean, why on earth would we be... I totally agree with you. We live in a society now which is crony capitalist and global corporatism. So you've got multinational global corporations that infiltrate governments. You know, most of our politicians, we can all agree they're bottom paid for. We all agree with that, left and right. So why on earth would we trust these people to go in and have such influence in corporations? And why, you know, I think in a world where we live in sort of global corporatism, you know, it's a double-edged sword. We need to live in a society where we've got successful businesses operating. They can employ people. You know, I work for a big corporation in the oil industry, and it's, you know, it employs thousands of people. Now, I don't know what those what the CEOs and shareholders get paid. I'm sure they haven't had pay cuts like we have in the recent climate. But without industry and without business, we'd all be unemployed. So why on earth would we start harassing people and causing people to want to leave the country? That's my point.
Yeah, I mean, Sam, you know, clearly in the corporate world, those ratios between what bosses earn and the average worker earns have widened hugely. Mind you, we could argue the same's happened in football, couldn't we? I mean, I don't know what the cleaner at Manchester United is paid, but I bet that multiple against the striker has changed pretty markedly over the last...
I would be surprised if there's anything above the living wage, to be honest.
Well, that's probably right. But yeah. Sam, how do shareholders express their voices a bit more clearly, you know, on this issue? Because people do care about this. And, you know, I mean, one of the elements of that referendum last year was millions of people saying, do you know what? The big bosses, the big politicians, the big banks are having it all their own way and nobody gives us a voice. It was part of that frustration, part of that feeling of unfairness that did lead a significant number of people to vote for Brexit.
Well, perhaps instead of having governments meddling in, you know, asking people what they're getting paid and having limits and caps put on what people can get paid, how about they concentrate on transparency and letting people see what money's been pumped offshore, what money's being held in accounts that isn't being paid tax on.
Or what private health insurance they've got, or what other perks, or what their expense accounts are. Gosh, I hope that would never apply to me in a private company. But no, Sam, I think transparency rather than government interference. I agree with that point of view entirely. Sam from Aberdeen, thank you. Now, David Buick is back with me. David.
Nigel, I apologise, sir. I had a long conversation with myself, and it's unlike you and I not to interrupt each other. So, go ahead. Where have we got?
Well, David, you know, the point I'm making is that there is a perception out there that the big boys, the fat cats in corporate business are hand in glove with political leaders and with big banks, and that the world has become a very much less fair place. And I can see that what Theresa May has done today is to somewhat backtrack from her manifesto, which was very, very interventionist, and many would argue actually not very conservative in many ways. But David, my question is, how does the market, how do shareholders actually exert their influence to stop excesses? And by the way, I'm not going to fight you. You know, if somebody is a phenomenal chief executive who revolutionises a country, who gives those shareholders good dividends, and by the way, every listener here would benefit there from their pensions and all the rest of it, I haven't got a problem. Rather like, you know, the top striker of a football club. If he scored 25 goals in a season, you know, he's probably worth the money. But how does the market make sure the thing's being done fairly?
It's a combination of two things. I mean, your previous contributor, I completely and totally endorse what he says, is that there has to be a level of self-regulation and not government intervention. And it shouldn't actually be that difficult. The excesses are very, very clear for everyone to see. But as I said to you before, I think comparing apples with pears is a dangerous thing to do. I have a complete disassociation between what I call entrepreneur and what I call manager.
Yes.
So somebody like Martin Sorrell, who's earned a fortune, he's run that company, man and voice, for 33 years. And he takes his money in the form of an enormous dividend because of his huge shareholding. People shouldn't worry about that sort of thing. Where I have a problem is where somebody like Rakesh Kapoor, who a couple of years ago had $39 million as a manager of Reckitt Benckiser, I don't think so. I think that's excessive. And I think basically that on boards of directors that I don't believe three things. Shareholders are much better than they were at abrogating their responsibilities to making sure that if they are aggrieved at the kind of awards that are given, that they actually do something about it. But I also think the non-executive directors in many of these companies don't do their job properly. And they sit and they draw their money, whether it's 25 grand or 100 grand a year, you know, for 4 appearances a year. This simply will not do.
So change is needed, David.
Sorry.
So change is needed somewhere here.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But it's a question of a coordinated approach rather than government intervention. It should be, once you start interfering in what I call a free market or free enterprise, then you change the whole emphasis of business. The gap between those that have and those that have not is totally unacceptable. And there wouldn't be a single person in the country who would disagree with that thought. But how you actually come around to it, I don't know. But it has to be self-regulation is the greatest thing. People know perfectly well what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable. The other thing that we, of course, never take into account, or the average person doesn't take into account, is what is international, Nigel, and what is just domestic. International, you are subject to the vagaries of competition everywhere. And the problem is that it's not just what you're going to do in the United Kingdom, it's whether you'll lose your chief executive to the United States or somewhere else.
No, I know. I get that, David. I understand that, and that is difficult. David, I thank you very much for coming back to us, having lost you to begin with. David Buick there, market analyst from Panmure Gordon. Thank you. And he's making the point. Non-executive directors need to get off their backsides, stop taking money for nothing, and do something on behalf of fairness and shareholders and people who are going to earn pensions. I'm Nigel Farage on LBC. It's 4:15. Theresa May said in the Tory manifesto she would deal with fat cat corporate pay, and that's because the rich are getting richer, and they are, and the ratios between what the bosses of big companies earn and the average worker has widened and widened and widened over the course of the last few years. But when it came to giving her speech, she backtracked a little bit from full intervention, leading, of course, to the Labour Party and the trade unions, saying she was feeble and weak. But ultimately, if we've got a problem here with fat cats earning too much money, and in some cases not producing the goods, the real question is, whose responsibility is it to deal with excessive pay? Is it the job of government, or is it the job of shareholders? Because what we're talking about here are the big footsie companies. We're not talking about the local entrepreneur down the road with 2 members of staff. We're talking about public companies. We're talking about companies who have shareholders, pension funds. In fact, we're talking about companies in which virtually every one of you listening has a direct stake. So this does actually matter. But should government interfere? And if government interferes, does it make it worse? And if not, how do we get shareholders to be a little bit more active at their annual AGMs? And I'm going to go to Roger in Storrington in beautiful West Sussex. Roger, good afternoon.
Oh, good afternoon, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. I'm sort of curious, Roger, because there is a lot of me that says that the modern corporate world, frankly, has got a bit out of control, and yet the last thing I want to see is for government to intervene. Or am I wrong, Roger? Should government set pay for everybody?
No, I think we've seen too much of a government bureaucracy, Nigel, and I think it damages entrepreneurs. What we need, I believe, is, if I can just phrase my question, because you recall Enron, the chief executive, based his performance bonus on share value, which can be manipulated without adding real value to the company. Of course, the shareholders also like to see the share price go up, so they're not going to control him. So the problem is, who is, as you quite rightly ask. Now, I believe that the best we can do is that we can find perhaps an independent company, as we have auditors, to actually do this on behalf of the shareholders and make sure that the terms and conditions put into his performance appraisal are properly targeted. I did this in a large company, used to be called NatWest, and I did it successfully, and it wasn't easy, but the point is I had no personal interest in the outcome. I was totally objective, except my job.
But things, Roger, at the end of NatWest did go quite badly wrong, didn't they? I'm not saying it's your fault, by the way.
No.
But things did go... But your basic point about Enron, and for those that don't remember, it was a huge corporate disaster and collapse, and a lot of people lost a lot of money. A lot of ordinary people lost a lot of money. But, Roger, your point then is that if you pay people, if you pay chief execs on what the share price is, that can be a totally false reflection of what the company's real profits are.
Absolutely. But both the chief exec and the shareholders like it.
And there we have the problem, don't we?
Yeah, I think that is the nub of the problem, Nigel. The other thing you could do, of course,
good point,
with chief executives, is to say, whatever you do, you will not get your bonus for 3 to 5 years unless the company continues to improve. And
that's putting it into what I think, as sort of accountants call escrow, isn't it?
Yes.
It's putting the money aside, so you've notionally made these profits, but you don't actually get the money until they become realised. Roger, I thank you for your call. Roger making a fascinating point there, and I think highlighting a problem. I want this to be something that the market sorts out. I want it to be something that shareholders sort out. But Roger very cleverly pointing out that if the shareholders have a high share price, even if the chief executive is drunk after lunch every day and then on the golf course for the rest of the week, if they've got a high share price, why should they be worried? Until, of course, reality comes home and the whole thing collapses. Not that Enron necessarily is the example for everything. Jim in Chipping Norton is my next caller. Jim, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Nigel.
So, come on, tell me, are chief execs paid too much money, Jim, in your view?
No, I don't think they are.
Okay.
If you're an investor in a company, you invest your money and you get your dividend or whatever, which is dependent on the performance of the company, which is on the chief executive. It's not the government's place to chip their oar in and decide what people are paid. I think we're actually on the wrong subject, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
Far more concerned to me than executive pay in the private sector, which, after all, is the wealth generator of the nation. I'm more concerned with the fact that NHS chief executives on council, many public servants are paid double what our Prime Minister is paid. That strikes me as being absolutely ridiculous. Yeah, well, wasn't Tony Blair just wonderful for all these people in the public sector? Because not only, and you're quite right, Jim, not only are there people out there... I remember a few years ago looking at the northern town of Barnsley. Former mining community, not a wealthy part of the country as well, relatively small Yorkshire town. And we found that 6 people working for Barnsley Council were earning 6-figure money, and I frankly couldn't believe that. So I do understand your point about the public sector. Also, of course, in pension terms, the public sector now is very much better off than the private sector. So Jim, I do take your point, but that is something that I've not heard the Prime Minister say anything about at all. Well, no, if you go back to the referendum, we were campaigning and using the fact that there were more NHS administrators and managers than there were beds. Yeah, and of course, Jim... I've got no problem with a consultant being paid £200,000. If you've got a top heart surgeon, he's worth the money. Yeah. But Somebody's just a paper pusher. That's just ridiculous.
Yeah, well, Jim, one of the arguments, and you raised the referendum, not me, one of the points I made in the referendum is there are 10,000 people working in Brussels for the European Commission and the European Parliament. 10,000 people who earn more than the British Prime Minister. So whatever you think the excesses may be in the public sector in this country, there is nothing as compared to Brussels. Jim, you may well be right. We may be having the wrong debate, but it's the one the Prime Minister is trying to have with us today, and I thank you. And on Twitter I get, Nigel, you and David Buick are in favour of the free market until it goes wrong, and then you expect the taxpayer to bail you out, says Mark. Well, no, Mark, I don't actually. One of the reasons I hate modern corporatism on the scale that it is we finished up with companies that were simply too big to fail. The idea that the taxpayer should be forced to bail out people in the private sector, frankly, is total anathema to me. I believe that people should have the opportunity in the free market to make money, but equally to be able to go bust as well. And I believe much of what happened in that collapse of 2008 was a direct fault of government policy and a change of good sound rules we'd had in financial markets since basically the Wall Street crash. Don't we get more tax from fat cats paying the top rate of income tax at 45% than if they were paid less and the money goes into company profit where it's taxed at 20%, says Michael. Well, Michael, it's a very good point, but what we're talking about here is fairness, a perception of fairness. And I don't think anybody, nobody could doubt that the gap between rich and poor in this country has got markedly wider over the course of the last few years. I'm going to ask Celia in Wembley what she thinks. Celia, good afternoon.
Hello. Yeah, can you just answer me this question? Because I've Googled this question.
Yeah.
And what I Googled is why should people who are very rich and come by their money fairly, they haven't treated their workforce like donkeys, not them fairly or given them fair conditions just so as they can keep the money themselves and go off and buy a £10 million yacht. But they money fairly. Why should they pay a load of tax? Because, I Googled it and all it said was because they could afford it. Well, I class that as theft.
Well, there is, you're right in a way, because one way in which governments do regulate pay is not by setting caps in the marketplace, but through taxation. In some ways they do. And it is worth, Celia, reminding, younger people listening to this, that up until May 1979, the top rate of income tax in this country was 83%. 83%. And on unearned income, it could be as high as 98%. But income tax ran at 83%. And what happened, Celia, with that was that so many of our brightest and best young people headed off for Australia or America or elsewhere. So I do take that point, and I do think that taxation is one of the ways in which government does control those amounts of money. We had a 40% top rate tax rate for some years. We've now settled at 45. I don't see, frankly, much prospect of that going up or down over the course of the next few years. So would you argue, Celia, that we should all pay the same percentage regardless whether we earn a little or a lot?
Sorry?
Would you argue that we should all pay the same percentage regardless of what our income is?
No, I'm more concerned, and I think that what government should be concerned about is anybody who is getting rich on the backs of other people. In other words, they're not paying them fairly, not giving them fair paying conditions in order so they get a pile of money so they can go off and buy their yacht. That's what needs to stop. But you see, the problem is you can't just sort of put certain things in place because, like a lot of people say, that they know how to scrape the money back, to claw the money back. So I say give them some competition. Perhaps we should have some nationally run coffee bars and takeaways. And cake shops.
Oh, Celia, I reckon that's a recipe for disaster. But very interesting points you've made. More of your calls after the news and travel. I'm Nigel Farage, standing in for Ian Dale on Drive on LBC. It's 4:30. As we speak, there is a briefing going on in Texas by the US Air Force. A Major General is informing people on the latest situation in Texas with this huge tropical storm. One report I saw that said that one particular area had received 49 inches of rain over the course of the last 72 hours. Hard to believe. And now Louisiana and perhaps even Alabama threatened by this torrential downpour, huge, sort of one of biblical proportions, and we will in the next 10 minutes get a live report from Texas to find out exactly what the latest situation is. But for now, we're talking about Theresa May and her statement on big fat cat corporate pay. And I've yet to hear from a caller telling me that actually it's the government's job to set levels of pay. And anybody out there that thinks that, please call me on 0345 6060 973. Text me at 84850. Email nigel@lbc.co.uk or tweet at LBC using the hashtag Farage and LBC. So far, most of you think that it's right that actually the market, the shareholders, sort this out. But Roger from Storrington quite wisely pointed out there's a bit of a problem here. That if a company has an inflated share price, even if it's as a result of excessive speculation and not reality, why in those circumstances would the shareholders want to limit someone's pay? So that really isn't particularly easy. Chris says to me on Twitter, the profits companies make are bypassing us and going straight to tax-avoiding CEOs. Of course, it's the government's job. May won't do it, of course. Well, Chris, I'm not sure that all CEOs are tax avoiding. I think a lot of them, particularly if they're PLCs, are paying their tax. But Chris, if it's the government's job to set pay for public limited companies, would it equally be the government's job to set pay rates for, let's say, footballers? Or maybe international cricketers who are out there doing battle with the West Indies as we speak. That's the problem. If you really want government to intervene, and we had all of this, we had prices and incomes policies, not for bosses, for workers, but we had all of this back in the 1970s. It collapsed in huge acrimony between the trade unions and the government. It led directly to a general election that indeed the Deadwood Heath lost. And I just, OK, Chris, you believe that. I just find it really difficult to believe that government could get involved in this and do the job properly. Joanna makes a suggestion and says it should be an independent body moderating pay. Can't expect the companies to do it. Vested interests. Governments are also corruptible. So, but again, if you set up a so-called independent commission to set levels of pay, actually, in the end, effectively, it becomes an arm of government. If you have a pension, mortgage or savings, you are probably a shareholder by proxy in multiple organisations. Have your say, I get from Spike on Twitter. Look, yes, I agree with that. Absolutely. It's the point I've been making all the way through. This is not just some obscure debate about what's going on in city boardrooms. It affects absolutely all of us. I wonder whether Zainal in Crawley, West Sussex, has got a solution for us.
Hi there, Nigel. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My thinking is that when Theresa May became the leader of the party and then she became the Prime Minister, prior to that she had promised that there will be worker representation on the boards, like what they have in Germany. She said that is what she was pushing for. But then she backtracked on that and said it should be a voluntary thing done. If we do something like that, that the workers feel that they are part of this company, and they can have some input in how the whole thing is been run and other issues, it will be a good thing. But I think she backtracked on that and did a U-turn on that.
Yeah, I mean, Zainal, it's very interesting. When we look back at that sort of period of great economic and in many ways social gloom in this country of the 1970s, a lot of people say, it was all because of these terrible Marxist trade union leaders. But actually, I think there was some pretty appalling management around in British industry at that point in time too. Surely, if you're running a company and you want it to be a success, you want the workers to feel engaged, involved, motivated in terms of promotion prospects and pay prospects. So surely a successful company would not have a board that was completely disconnected from its workers. My problem, Zainul, comes when governments, and you're right, in a sense, originally she was suggesting that legislation should put workers on boards, and now she wants it to be something that is done sort of on the back of a recommendation. But Zainul, should government interfere with this, or should we let private companies sort it out?
Well, we have waited for too long for the private companies to do that, and they're not willing to do that. If you look at the German economy, we sadly have a situation in our country here where it's them and us attitude which is prevailing in industry and all that. If we added the German model that we are all working together, if you are working in one company, you're all looking for, to make that company successful. Then if you got everybody on board, then you can, it will be much easier to achieve that.
So the us and them problem in British industry, in British business, is still there, alive and well, in your opinion?
Sadly, yes. I think that we have still not got out of that mentality of them and us idea about the whole way that the whole thing is run. How can you have two different groups of people who, although each depend on other, but they want to sort of still maintain the whole system of them and us?
Yeah, I mean, in a way that's a bit depressing, isn't it? I do not want the government to get involved and do this, but I can see that anyone running a private company that has got shareholder investment in it, it is in their interests to have a happy workforce that are doing their best and can see their own chances of improving themselves. And Zainul, if firms aren't doing that, and if there is the continuation of the them and us attitude, then there's a problem. But maybe one of those problems is maybe the average worker realises that his or her wages have been depressed over the course of the last decade, and there are perhaps a separate debate as to why that's happened, whereas they see the bosses getting more and more money. So I think, actually, Zainul, I think you're right. I think we genuinely do have an us and them problem that is there in British business and is there in British industry too. Hi, Nigel. Easy solution, Rob from Sutton is giving me. I like easy solutions. Link the national living wage to the pay of the FTSE 100 directors. Rob, if you do that, it's not free enterprise. If you do that, effectively, you've applied the rules of the public sector to the private sector. If you do that, you become the ultimate socialist, state-run economy. And all the evidence is that whenever you do that, whenever the government intervenes and tries to set prices for things, it simply doesn't work. And I think that, frankly, I'm sorry, Rob, you did offer it up to me as an easy solution. Frankly, I think that would be a disaster. Do we have a problem? Yes. Are the rich getting richer? Yes. Is there a growing feeling, perhaps, of disenchantment amongst people on average salaries who've spent 10 years seeing very little improvement? Yes. But is it the job of the government, and whatever colour of government, whether it's a blue one or a red one, frankly, the government, are the people who have worked to help to enhance this corporate culture that has led to this widening of the gap. And I do not believe their interference would do anything. We've got to get shareholder activism. We had David Buick on from Panmure Gordon saying one of the problems was non-executive directors. We had Roger from Storrington pointing out that if the share price is good, they're not going to do anything. I'm not saying I've got a perfect solution to this. I haven't. But I do believe if government interferes, it will make a bad situation even worse, because it nearly always does. I'm Nigel Farage on LBC. It's 4:45. In the last 15 minutes, Major General James Witham, Deputy Director of the Air National Guard, has given an update on the rescue efforts in Texas.
There are currently 3,000 Texas Guardsmen on duty today. They'll be growing to approximately 4,000 over the next 24 hours. The governor of Texas has requested a military police battalion and Air National Guard security forces to assist local, state, and federal law enforcement, specifically in the heavily flooded areas. That big metropolitan area around Houston is where we think most of that assistance will be required. In terms of rescues, and I want to be careful when I talk numbers in terms of rescues, obviously, these are very fluid. As you all see, there's a great deal of rescues occurring around, by the minute. but those that the National Guard has either directly done or supported civil authorities for, those include over 3,500 personnel rescued. Most of those, as you see, have been by some type of boat, but these also include almost 300 hoist rescues, which, as you know, are very technically difficult in terms of hoisting people off roofs where they're inaccessible by any other method.
Well, that was General Major James Witham, Deputy Director of the Air National Guard in Texas, giving us an update on the extraordinary rescue efforts that are going on there. And my next guest is John Labus. He's the editor of KTRH Radio in Houston, Texas. John, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to you, Nigel.
What do you make of the statements that the Major General just made? I mean, is that the scale of it, or actually are people helping each other as well?
You're seeing an incredible amount of an incredible number of people that are just neighbors helping neighbors around here. I happen to, my office happens to sit right here on one of the major highways in the Houston area, and yesterday, whenever there were a great number of water rescues that were required on the north side of town, you could see truck after truck after truck going down the street towing low draft boats, bass boats, and other types of vessels like that in order to be able to help out with the rescue and the recovery effort. We just here within the last hour, I know the president has landed and he's surveying some of the damage down in Corpus Christi, a couple hundred miles to our south, but we had a levee breach along the Brazos River just to the south of us here within about the last half hour or so. And again, the moment that this news arrives to our listening audiences and to the viewership around the Houston area, all of a sudden, all of those people with their trucks and with their low draft their low draft boats, now they're turning around and heading down to the south side in order to be able to help with the recovery effort. It really is. It's amidst disaster, it is something that really restores your faith in humanity.
Yeah. Oh, John, what does it look like? I mean, is it just water as far as the eye can see?
It is water and rain on an unimaginable scale. And I tell folks all the time, I am not trying to be dramatic whenever I say that. I mean, we are seeing flooding on a historic level that has never been seen in U.S. history. It's just, I mean, whenever you're talking about rain totals that had already exceeded 40 inches since the start of this storm, and we're expecting another 3 inches today, they're talking about the possibility of 8 to 10 to 12 inches before this storm finally moves its way out of the region. I mean, the amount of rain, the amount of water is just, it's astounding.
And do we have any idea, John, as to what the casualty rate may or may not be?
We have heard as high as 14. There was some very, very tragic stories that came out of Pasadena, Texas, which is one of our suburbs here, of a family with young elementary school children all the way up through great-grandparents. And so it was several generations of family that was in their van. They were trying to evacuate, and apparently the father lost control of the vehicle, and their bodies were swept away at the floodwaters. So, I mean, there is a great deal of tragedy that goes along with everything we're seeing here.
And there may be many more stories like that we haven't as yet heard. And
unfortunately.
And the president, desperate not to repeat the mistakes of Bush after Katrina, he's there in Corpus Christi. Do you think that Trump turning up in Texas is a good thing?
It's a little premature to say. I think that people are heartened to know that the federal resources are staged and ready to move in as soon as recovery efforts are going to be able to start here in Houston. I mean, Corpus Christi is a couple hours south of us, and so I'm sure that they're probably already well on their way now. Yeah. We know that the resources are staged. We're still waiting for the rain to abate here before we can really start doing damage assessment and start worrying about resupply. And so I think in terms of worrying about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, we're merely heartened by the fact that we know the resources are there and they're just waiting for their opportunity to come in to help us out.
Yeah. John, thank you ever so much for giving us that briefing, and please, we'll come back to you in the course of the next couple of days. Thank you. That was John Labus, editor of KTRH Radio in Houston, Texas, talking there perhaps in slightly optimistic terms, that a horrible crisis brings out the very best in people in terms of them helping one another. And yeah, sure, there are helicopters taking people off roofs and all the rest of it, but ordinary folk going out there and doing their bit, which he said he found pretty heartening. So 40 inches of rain in most of Texas already, and another up to 8 to 10 inches expected. And some areas have had 50 inches of rain already. That is kind of more than, well, actually, that's more than most of the UK would get in a year, and they've had it in the course of a few days. Back for the last few minutes to my subject, that Theresa May, keen to be seen to do something about fat cat pay, but backs off ever so slightly from full government intervention, but says something must be done. Paul from Ealing is my next caller. Paul, tell me the government can solve all of this, please.
I'll see what the government can do. The government can mind their own business. All this is them wanting to know what people are earning or companies are earning. It's got nothing to do with them. It's got nothing to do with me. I come into work. My company earns millions of pounds a year. It's easy to work out. We all know that anyway. But it's got nothing to do with me. I don't want to be sitting on some board. It's of no use to me. It won't get me nowhere, and it's not going to improve anything anyway.
And what sort of firm do you work for, Paul? Is it a private company? Is it a public company?
That I don't know, but I drive a lorry.
Yeah.
So I'm here, there, and everywhere, delivering stuff, collecting stuff.
Right.
And we do well. You know what I mean? It started off as one truck, one driver, like the governor. He built up a reputation. We've now got 42 trucks, 42 drivers.
Yeah.
And we've got fitting bays, tyre bays, and we've got the offices, and we've got employed people in the offices, we employ people in the trucks, and we employ like a mechanic or two. Well, I say we, the governor does.
Yeah. So do you? I mean, Paul, do you and your? There's 42 of you driving trucks for the governor. Do you sort of feel at times resentful that perhaps he's earning 100 times what you are, or 150 times what you are?
No, not at all. It's a case of we're like, yeah. If we don't really talk about it, it's we don't come in and go, oh dear, I wish we could have a bit more of what the governor's earning. It's a case of the governor's earning what the governor's earning. The same with every company around the country, and it's got nothing to do with me how much the governor earns. It's got nothing to do with it's got nothing to do with anybody.
And Paul, are you incentivised that if you do your job well, your pay's going to improve, your conditions are going to improve?
Well, conditions won't really improve. I drive a lorry. I come in, I'll get in my truck, and I'll go out and do my work. It can't improve any more than that. And there's no... If I want to go and buy my own truck and spend the next few years building up a good reputation with companies and build up... I mean, this isn't something that's happened overnight. This has taken 20, 30 years. Do you know what I mean? And it's like people who turn around and say, well, yeah, but if we know how much the governor's getting, like he should share the wealth. Rubbish. You know what I mean? If you want more money, go out, do it on your own.
And take the risk. Yeah. Well, Paul, I think for the private sector, that is absolutely right. The only difference with this debate we're having now, this is about the big public companies, and David Bioek, our analyst earlier, said there's a difference between entrepreneurs and people who come in as managers. Paul, thank you ever so much for your call, and thank you, everybody, for contributing to that subject. Well, coming up next, Donald Trump has said that all options are on the table after North Korea launches a missile designed to carry a nuclear payload, and it went straight over Japan. And quite extraordinary that this morning at 6 a.m. local time, alarms were going off all over the islands and across northern Japan. A country that itself suffered 2 nuclear strikes, albeit 70-something years ago. North Korean regime has signalled its contempt for neighbours, says the Prime Minister of Japan. It's a very serious situation. What should the US President do next? Is it time to unleash fire and fury like the world has never seen, or is this the path to war?
On FM. From Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nigel Farage.
Yes, if you're just tuning in, it is Nigel Farage. I'm here standing in for Ian Dale, doing the drive show between now and Friday. And I guess there are two huge stories today. The floods, which we've just been talking about directly to Houston. But the other big overnight story, and it's a huge story, is that North Korea have fired a missile over Japan. And it is something that Trump says is an unprecedented and grave threat. The 40-minute conversation he had with the Japanese Prime Minister, and clearly, despite many of the things that have been said, the North Koreans are simply not backing down at all. Now, joining me to discuss this is Tina Park. She's a North Korea expert and Vice President of the NATO Association of Canada and Fellow at the Asian Institute of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. Tina, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So does this missile that was fired overnight over Japanese territory that led to, air raid warnings going off, which must have led to panic and actually people getting texts on their mobile phones saying, go into a bunker, get underground. I mean, does this incident represent a very, very grave escalation of this crisis?
Absolutely. It poses a real threat to not only the population in Japan and the Hokkaido region, but also everybody watching who are immediate neighbors of Japan. So the Korean Peninsula is at the geostrategic center of Northeast Asia with very powerful neighbors like China and Russia, in addition to Japan. And it just raises alarm in the sense that North Korea is progressively testing new weapons with more frequency and also testing different kinds of missiles. This particular missile was launched from a very urban area in Pyongyang near the airport. So the idea that the United States could engage in any surgical military fashion is very much unlikely, given that this was launched out of a civilian site. And also, right after Secretary of State Tillerson mentioned the possibilities for dialogue with North Korea, I think North Korea is saying that they're very much intent on continuing to invest and improve upon their military capabilities.
So the problem we have here is that the US president, and this is prior to this missile going over Japanese space, but prior to all of this, Trump had said that if they carried on with these escalations and began to threaten American space, they would receive fire and fury like the world has never seen. I mean, I think, even by Trump standards, this is pretty dramatic stuff. So, Tina, what happens now? What happens if, the North Koreans continue to provoke in this way? What does Trump do now, having made those threats?
Well, Nigel, I think it's very difficult to predict how President Trump will respond. But what we do know is that we're in the middle of a joint military drill on the Korean Peninsula called Uchi Freedom Guardian Exercise, which is an annual affair between the South Korean forces and the American forces and its allies, which is going to happen for the next few days. And the timing of North Korea's missile launch is very significant precisely because it's right in the middle of the military exercise. And yes, we've heard so much about the rhetoric, exchange of rhetoric between President Trump and the North Korean state media, which has raised a lot of tension, not just for the people on the Korean Peninsula, but all of us watching from outside. And I think President Trump and his advisors and political leaders in Washington will need to seriously assess what they're willing to negotiate with North Korea, because right now, with North Korea testing new missiles, especially targeted towards Japan, dialogue is looking very difficult, and there will be pressure from Japan to be ready, be militarily ready, be more engaging in terms of responding to North Korea's threats. And I think we should be very much alert about the speed with which North Korea has been testing their missiles. And
Tina, it's a very difficult question to answer and a depressing thought in many ways. But do you think, with your expertise of this region and the players, do you think inevitably we're headed towards a war of some kind?
Well, Nigel, I am of the opinion that any form of military confrontation on the Korean Peninsula will be deadly. We're looking at a country that is the size of a 100th of the size of Canada in terms of the land size. So in terms of any kind of confrontation between South Korea and North Korea, they have enough conventional weapons to cause a lot of damage within 30 minutes.
Yes.
So I think we're not approaching any closer towards war in the sense that both sides are fully aware of the potential consequences in human terms, in economic terms, and also in terms of chaos and instability it will cause to the region in general. That said, I think we should be very much alarmed by the fact that Kim Jong-un is very much intent on developing new weapons, and North Korea is remarkably successful in improving their military capabilities. Kim Jong-un alone has overseen over 80 missile tests, which is more than his father and grandfather combined in terms of how much North Korea has come through in their military capabilities. And that's something for us to be very concerned about, especially considering that there are millions of people starving in North Korea. So it's a very desperate economy, and the ideological regime that is on the brink of collapse. Yet they are threatening the international community with their military capabilities. And that's enough of reason for us to be very concerned about the future of Korea.
And let's just think for one moment, Tina, before I let you go, let's just have a think about the way Donald Trump is handling us. Let's just have a listen with me. Remind ourselves of that speech he gave a few weeks ago.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before.
And I assume, Tina, what he means is that if a missile was to threaten American airspace, I'm not sure they've got the capability right yet, but if a missile was to threaten American airspace, that he would launch a strike of some kind. But as you point out, you know, this can't be done surgically because they can have these launching sites all over the place, even in urban areas. Is the American president taking the right route with this?
I think we have to be very careful in terms of the level of rhetoric and the threats that have been exchanged between President Trump and the North Korean state media. And the language like fire and fury is something that North Korea thrives on because the country is built upon ideology and propaganda and strong rhetoric. So, in fact, something like fire and fury reference was introduced by the North Korean regime about 20 years ago about turning Seoul into a sea of fire. So when you have president in the United States who is very much ad hoc in his approach towards foreign policy and who likes to directly engage on very complex issues like the North Korean nuclear threat, we're looking at a very dangerous scenario because there's a very high chance of misunderstanding and miscalculation when you're dealing with a regime like North Korea that has very little to lose and that is very desperate in terms of showcasing its power. So I think moving forward, it would be very important for the United States to exercise prudence and coherence and send a clear message to North Korea in terms of what it's willing to negotiate, and also to not provoke them further because a war of rhetoric between the United States and North Korea will bring nothing that is positive in terms of finding a constructive solution for the serious challenge we face on the Korean Peninsula.
I hope you're right. And how do you think people in Japan are feeling today? I mean, it's 1945, August 1945, 2 nuclear bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and people waking up this morning, you know, to air raid sirens and being told to head for bunkers or cellars. I mean, this surely, psychologically, must be having a big effect on Japan.
Absolutely. I've spoken to some colleagues in Japan who are all very much alarmed. They feel very directly threatened by this latest missile test. And this is also very important from the regional perspective because everything is so close by in terms of proximity between the countries in Northeast Asia that inevitably Japan will call for a stronger approach in terms of dealing with North Korea. And they're already saying that just dialogue alone will not cut it and time for talking is over. So this will only help the Japanese government's position in terms of calling for stronger military response from the United States and also changing the tone from what the South Korean president has been advocating, which is to engage with North Korea towards dialogue and reconciliation. So the latest testing from North Korea, and we've seen many different types of missile testing in the last few weeks, will only raise the sense of alarm in terms of how the Japanese are feeling, in addition to how the Chinese are feeling. The Chinese are very upset about the deployment of THAAD, which is the defense shield system that the United States is introducing with South Korea in the region. And all of these developments coming out of North Korea will encourage a sense of fear and paranoia, and also a realization that we can't just ignore North Korea as a crazy dictatorship that is inventing weapons.
Oh no, Tina, after today, nobody will be ignoring North Korea. I'm absolutely certain of that. Tina Park, North Korean expert, thank you so much for giving us your analysis of this very, very worrying, and I think in some ways a little bit frightening situation with regards to North Korea. Well, President Trump has said if they threaten American space at all, they'll be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Is this the path to war, or is it the right thing to do? I'm Nigel Farage, standing in for Ian Dale on Drive at LBC. The time is 5:15. North Korea ups the ante and fires a missile over Japanese airspace, leading to the alerts going off, the J alerts going off over large parts of northern Japan, and people being told to head for bunkers or for shelter. It's serious, and this comes in the wake of President Trump speaking a few weeks ago, saying if North Korea was to threaten America in any way at all, they would have upon them unleashed fire and fury like the world has never seen. Is this the path to war, or is Trump right? Do you at some point have to stand up to somebody like this? Is there perhaps a lesson from this that goes back to the 1930s? Perhaps if we'd stopped that Mr. Hitler, who so many in England thought was a very nice fellow in 1933, 4 and 5, a fact that's been very conveniently forgotten by history. Had we stopped him at the Sudetenland in 1936, could we have avoided a massive war in which many tens of millions of people died? Is Trump right to try and encourage the international community to stand up to Korea, and in particular to try and encourage the Chinese to say, look, something has got to be done? And the Chinese themselves overnight, in response to what's happened in Japan, the Chinese government says that a tipping point approaching a crisis has been reached. So it is a very serious situation, and I'm asking you, is Trump right to take the course of action with North Korea that he has? You can call me. Let me know. Trump right or wrong, 0345 60 60 973. You can text to 84850. And, of course, you can tweet on @LBC using the hashtag Farage on LBC. Let's listen to what Prime Minister Theresa May's response has been to what North Korea did overnight.
Well, these action by North Korea is reckless provocation. These are illegal tests, and we strongly condemn them. There will be an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council later this afternoon, and we will continue to work with our international partners to put pressure on North Korea to stop these illegal tests. And, of course, I will have the opportunity on my visit to Japan over the next few days to be discussing these issues with Prime Minister Abe. I'm absolutely clear that trip to Japan will go ahead. It gives me the opportunity to sit down with Prime Minister Abe over the next few days and to discuss the action that North Korea has taken. As I say, these are illegal tests. We strongly condemn them, and we will be working with Japan and other international partners to ensure that pressure is put on North Korea to stop this illegal action.
So it's condemnation the world over for North Korea firing a missile over Japanese airspace overnight. But what, folks, what should Trump do next? He's up the ante with the rhetoric on America being threatened. And I wonder I wonder, what is the best way of putting genuine pressure on North Korea, of getting them to back down, or is it, frankly, impossible? And I'm very keen to know that if you're from Japan, or you've got family and friends living out there, call me and tell me, how you feel about this threat from North Korea. And surely, there just has to be, I would have thought, within Japanese folklore, memories of what happened in August 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And at no point since then have the air sirens actually, apart from tests, have the air sirens actually been played in Japan. I can imagine people would have been very, very scared indeed. Jimmy says to me by text, America are holding massive war games close to North Korea. North Korea are showing they are ready to fight back. Well, Jimmy, that's right. And indeed, Tina, our expert, was on before making this point, that there are military exercises taking place between the South Koreans and the Americans. But when you get two rivals bidding to show each other who's the strongest, it's a pretty worrying state of affairs. Chris says to me, I don't know what the answer is here, but surely if Trump attacks North Korea, it will only lead to an all-out war with China. This can't even be an option. Well, I think Trump is doing all he can to get China on his side against North Korea. I'm not sure whether that's succeeding or not. I wonder what Al in Camden thinks. Al, hello.
Good afternoon, Nigel. How are you?
Well, I'm okay, but Trump was going to be a non-interventionist president, but clearly he looks at North Korea and believes that it is a genuine threat to world peace, and that's why he said what he said. But is this the right approach, Al?
Well, first, Nigel, I love your charisma. Not that I've always agreed with your thoughts, but I love your charisma.
Right.
What I wanted to ask you, Nigel, is this. If North Korea happened to be a Muslim country, what would the reaction have been by now? Honestly, Nigel, I have to ask you this question. What do you think would happen by now? If a Muslim country conducted itself like the way North Korea is doing now, and I think we pretty much, everyone who's your listener out there, we've got a rough idea what would happen by now.
So you're suggesting that had it been a Muslim country, they'd have bombed it already. Is that what you're saying?
Into smithereens, definitely. All gun-blading, all the Western nations, NATO would have been in there and sorted the issue up by now. This is my honest opinion, and I ain't the only one who feels this way.
I'm not sure that's right.
Well, I can't see it. How can North Korea get away with what it's doing and there is no intervention? Don't get me wrong, I'm against violence. I prefer diplomacy, but I just don't understand.
All right, well, I don't think you're right. I don't think if North Korea had been Muslim, it would have made, frankly, any difference at all. I think we are at a dangerous situation where the ante's been upped on both sides and where the response to Trump's words was a direct provocation to Japan. So I think we're in a very worrying place. On balance, I have to say, Al, on balance, I do think that, he may not be Mr. Hitler, but can we just stand aside to let this maniac develop his weapons and perhaps genuinely pose a threat to world peace? And I wonder, Al, do you think that the time has come for us to get together with our allies and hopefully the Chinese and to militarily try and neutralise North Korea?
No, I don't, because I think it's going to make it worse, Nigel. What I don't understand, why can't Mr. Trump just pick up the phone and invite this guy into the White House and sit, have dinner and talk? Why is it so difficult? Do
you know what? If he was to do that, it would be a genius move. He went during the presidential campaign, having said what he'd said about Mexico and some Mexicans, and do you remember he went down to Mexico, met the Mexican president, and from a PR perspective, it was a great thing to do. Al, he should extend the hand of friendship and say to Kim, come for dinner at the White House. You'll get a well-done steak with tomato ketchup, and you'll like it. Al, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Ben in Uxbridge is my next caller. So, Al thought that if it was a Muslim country, we'd have bombed it already. Is that right, Ben?
No, it's totally wrong. It's funny enough, I was just saying that actually, if ever a country was deserving of foreign intervention, it would be North Korea. Not because it's to quote a Muslim country, but because its population are effectively kept enslaved and immiserated. You need only read a book by, for example, Escape from Camp 14, which documents someone who was born into one of their labour camps and escaped to one of very, very few, who witnessed his mother and his brother being executed in front of him. It's a country where you know nothing but state propaganda. The average height of a North Korean is 6 inches shorter than that of his South Korean counterpart. They are starving to death in numbers. Estimates range from 250,000 people having been killed through effectively state genocide, effectively, at the lowest end, upwards of 3 million, because they can't get independent media to go anywhere that the state don't want them to see. But so there's a number of reasons why.
But isn't the truth, Ben, that the West couldn't care less, really, what's being done to North Koreans by its leadership? It's only when we're threatened that it wants to get involved.
No, I don't think that's the case. I think I'd actually love it. It might sound controversial if we did invade, but again, they're allied with China, and so we have to tread very, very carefully.
We do. But Ben, would you think the right approach was an invasion or airstrikes, or what should we do?
Well, ideally, there wouldn't be any military intervention. That's never a nice thing. But at the same time, I think this is what I mean. Do we sit idly by whilst people are literally in effectively labour camps, enslaved in their hundreds of thousands? Half of their electricity in lighting rooms, whenever you flick on the switch in a hotel room, is likely powered by slave labour. So this is what I mean. I think if ever a term genocide should be rightfully used, it's somewhere like North Korea.
Ben, it's a very strong, emotional argument that you make. Thank you very much, Ben in Uxbridge, for your call. I'm asking you, what does Trump do next? With clearly Kim chooses to ignore his threats of fire and fury. Is it time to act, or is it the route to all-out war, and would that be a disaster? I'm Nigel Farage, standing in for Ian Dale on Drive on LBC. It's now 5:30. Trump promises North Korea if they threaten America, they will be responded to with fire and fury like the world has never seen. Well, it's not America that was threatened overnight, but it was Japan that was threatened overnight as the North Koreans fired a missile over Hokkaido Island in Japan. And I'm asking you, what does Trump do next? He's made the threat, at least the threat, on behalf of America. He's done his best to get the international community involved. He even wants to get the Chinese involved, but that's complicated and it's difficult. What is the best way of putting genuine pressure on North Korea, or are we inevitably headed down the road towards a conflict of some kind? I wonder what John in Richmond makes of this great dilemma. John, good evening.
How you doing, Mr. Farage?
I'm doing okay, but I'm not a pacifist, John. I think military intervention is right sometimes. But
I'm not a pacifist myself. I'm a serving soldier.
Yes, okay. Thank you for telling us that. And how would you feel, John, as a serving soldier, if this military conflict with North Korea was to escalate?
Well, there's a couple of things that really wind me up, Mr. Farage, and one of these things is this statement about me joining the army. Apparently I know everything that I've signed up for. As a 16-year-old lad, I really didn't know that, and I've been in the army for 20 years now, and I've been involved in a lot of things that I really don't agree with. And also, I don't like the approach that we've taken to some things in the past. This argument that's going on here at the minute, it's being sensationalised a little bit for me, because I don't think we're on the brink of all-out World War III at all. I do think President Trump's words were maybe poorly chosen, but I do think that they were words that North Korea understand, because it is a rhetoric that they have used for years in the past. So fire and fury is something that they absolutely understand. It's also something that America are good at, because they're not very good at ground operations, if you ask me. I don't think they're good at counterinsurgency operations. I think they're good at creating insurgency.
Why is it, John? Every serving soldier I've ever spoken to in the British Army doesn't think the Americans are much good.
Well, you know what? The Americans are great. okay? As long as you can pull up somewhere with all your high-tech equipment, plug a Coke machine in, have your free cans of Pepsi on tap, and then just carry on spraying your weapon systems into the vast area. When you have to win hearts and minds, when you have to work with the people on the ground, they're not very good at that at all. And but fire and fury, if that's what he's going to do, I think they'll be all over that. I think they can do that. Do I think that's the approach that they need to take? No, I don't at all. But a different approach is needed, because this is nothing new. And I'm not all up on my politics, but I know that before Trump was in power, and there's a lot of people pointing finger at Trump at the minute, before he was in power, you had Obama with a similar kind of arguments towards North Korea and no action done. You had Bush before him for 2 terms, and again, nothing was done there. And you also had Clinton having the same argument as well. And yet North Korea are still responding in the manner they did, and in the manner that they are. And yes, something does need to be done.
Yes.
But I don't feel at the minute with this launch that America has been threatened.
No.
I
agree with that. No, I agree with that. I agree with that. America hasn't been directly threatened, but the point is that all the time the ante's being upped on both sides, isn't it? It
is. But I think Japan are well within their rights to respond, not just after this launch, but they've been targeted. They're in that operational area. They're going to be drawn in one way or another if something does go on there. But a lot of the launches have been in their direction, and now this one has gone over them. And as I said before, I had to Google where Guam was, and this missile, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe was on the flight path going towards Guam.
No, it wasn't.
But again, I don't think it's all-out war between Japan and North Korea. There needs to be a different approach that does. And, if it's in terms of protecting yourself, Israel have got a fantastic system there, Iron Dome, I believe it's called. Let's start taking these missiles out in the air. Let's just totally negate North Korea and say, all right, so you're putting all this investment into these missiles, you're going to launch them. Every missile that goes up in the air is going to get taken out in the air. Okay,
But all it would need, John, and you can have every missile shield you want, and I've heard all this stuff that nothing would ever get through, but it only needs one to get through, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course it does. It only needs one to get through, and then this is a worrying thing, because where do you escalate from there? But another thing is as well, it's North Korea, and yet you had the Canadian lady on before, and I struggle to understand her, to be honest with you. But we don't know enough about this place. With people.
Well, we know that it's
in the past.
We know that it's repressive,
like
John.
State. We know it's regressive. We know it's this secretive state. That's something that's used a lot. You know that every time someone's brave enough to go across that landmined area and defect to the south, we know about the things that they say. These people in this country are starving, apparently. These people in this country are ruled by fear. These people in this country don't know what's going on in the outside world. And I think that's where we start. I think if we manage to get a message around that country to the right people, it'd be them. They'd be your best asset and your best ally.
And John, you've served 20 years in the British Army.
I've served 20 years, yeah.
And you're staying on, or what's your situation?
Oh, no, I've had enough. I'm finishing my time, I'm getting my pension. I don't want to promote any further. I've had enough. I'm out of here.
Right, OK. Well, we thank you, John, for your service.
No problem.
Even if you were sent into conflicts you didn't always agree with, but I guess that is part of being a serving soldier, isn't it? John, thank you very much indeed for your call. What does Trump do next? Is the time ready for action, or should we wait and see? Ben in Worthing, what do you got to say?
Hi, Nigel.
Hi.
I found myself not very often, I don't think ever, really agreeing with many of the things that you say, but today I found myself kind of agreeing with pretty much most of what you said.
Okay.
I think in many respects North Korea is no different than a petulant child. They're just testing their boundaries. I think, similar to a call said earlier with regards to Muslim countries, I don't think that's necessarily the issue.
No,
I think it's more that there are no natural resources or anything to be taken from North Korea. Hence, I think there's no real interest to kind of go in and make any changes to the regime in North Korea. Otherwise, something would have been done. In terms of Donald Trump, I think he's kind of acted as I think a few other callers have said, kind of in words and language that North Korea understands. But North Korea, rather than kind of taking that as a provocation, going, let's see how far he can go, and put, a missile towards them, hasn't done that. And he's gone to the next available place. He's gone to Japan. So I think it's down to Japan to maybe kind of react in the same sort of way as kind of Donald Trump has. I think they're just kind of seeing where they can and can't get away. I don't think we're close to World War III. I think as petulant as Kim Jong-un kind of comes across, I think he's very aware of the impact of what could happen. He could essentially lose everything.
Well, if he's rational, Ben, if he's rational, then you're absolutely right, because he will know.
But he's not, yes.
But the sort of slight worry is that he's not rational. Trouble is, Ben, I mean, it was Theodore Roosevelt, over 100 years ago, who said that American foreign policy should be dictated by speaking softly and carrying a big stick. Now, Trump carries a big stick, and that is the US Navy, Army and Air Force. That's a huge stick, but he's certainly not speaking softly, is he? And so where does he go as a leader? Because he said what he said. So if they were to be able or capable of a missile entering Alaskan airspace, for argument's sake, he would almost now have no option, would he, but to respond?
Yes, sort of. I appreciate what you say about Roosevelt, but obviously, that was then, we are now. So the capabilities and the technology has obviously changed. So obviously, the rhetoric has to change with that.
Yeah, but the principles, Ben, don't have to necessarily change, do they?
No, that's very fair. I mean, if it does become possible that North Korea do have something that could potentially enter into Alaskan airspace, then obviously that's something that we're kind of, or America should be kind of prepared for in the first instance. I generally don't believe that that's where it's going to go. I think it's just a child shouting, and then Trump, in this sense, kind of shouting back. And there's not really been a lot of communication backwards and forwards with America since. So it kind of came to a head between the two of them, and it's now North Korea seems to have kind of, in some respects, ignored America, and they're going to their next kind of, well, I'm not getting a response from that person, I'm now going to put something over Japan. And it's now, I think, for Japan to kind of have a much stronger response than they have had so far. So then, I would say, if that was to happen, then there would be like another target for North Korea. It kind of seems like they're just going from one to the next to the next. Well, if Kim Jong-un was as unpredictable as we all believe him to be, then why not test the Americans and how far they're going to go if he's genuinely wanted to go that far and he is as prepared as he says he is?
Well, one good thing, Ben, that's happened overnight is that the number of people really worried about North Korea has grown because the Japanese clearly are, and I would imagine there would have been some real panic in some parts of Hokkaido and northern Japan today. Ben from Worthing, I thank you for your call. I'm Nigel Farage at LBC, standing in for Ian Dale. It's 5:45. So the 45th President of the USA is on the ground in Corpus Christi in Texas, and it's very interesting. He hasn't gone to Houston, and I don't think he was actually welcome in Houston because they have a major emergency on their hands. And it poses a question for leaders, how they should react to disasters. And the one thing that Trump will have absolutely uppermost in his mind is not to repeat the mistakes of 13 years ago. And remember, Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans, devastation, death, and President Trump advised not to visit, advised not to get in the way. So he flew over the devastated, flooded area, and the photograph that appeared in the press was the president looking out of a window from 20,000 feet at the devastation below. And for many, it was seized upon as a wealthy, upper-class Republican being totally out of touch with everyday America. And Trump does not want to make that same mistake, and that's why he's there in Corpus Christi, and in time he'll be there in Houston. And I can promise you he will be front and centre of as much of this as he possibly can. I also think that he will do his best to make promises, to be very generous in terms of compensation. And last we heard, at least 500,000 people are going to qualify for compensation of some kind. Although, I have to say, having spoken to correspondents on this show tonight, given that levees are breaking on banks, and as you just heard on the news, that one of the dams is now, on the verge of breaking, that number could increase very significantly indeed. I'm asking you to answer a question for me. Given that the North Koreans fired a missile over Japanese airspace overnight, triggering off air raid sirens, I'm asking you, what should Trump do next? He's told them, if America's threatened, it's fire and fury like the world has never seen. Let me know, what should Trump do next? The number is 0345 60 60 973. Text 84850. Tweet at LBC using the hashtag Farage on LBC. Simon in Northampton, what should Trump do next, if anything?
Hi, Nigel. Good to speak to you.
Hello.
Thanks for taking the call. Nigel, you talked earlier about him inviting Kim Jong for a steak in the White House.
Yes.
I don't believe he should be inviting him there for a steak. He needs, and I forget, unfortunately, the president's name, but the Prime Minister of China.
Xi.
He's the guy, Lee, that's it. Yeah, he is the guy that I believe Trump needs to deal and engage with next. I work for a company who manufactures in China, along with other British companies and other companies from around the world. And you can clearly see over the last however many years, China is looking to open its trade with the world. How badly does China really need that trade with North Korea? He should be inviting Premier Lee to the White House for a steak. He should be, basically, his next step should be dealing with some sort of pact or treaty with China to get them on side. And then, because let's face it, Kim Jong-un isn't going to be travelling to Washington anytime soon. No,
I know that. I know that. I know that. It was a suggestion.
The guy's mad. I mean,
it was a suggestion from a caller. And Simon, as a gesture, it would certainly wrong foot the North Korean regime. But I don't see it being accepted either. No, I understand that.
And I think what I think is valuable to the rest of the world is is the global trade that the world can have with China. Let's be honest. You look at all the goods in the world. How much of it is produced in China? A hell of a lot. And actually, you know what? Let's get that in. Let's get that lined up. Get Trump to be on the right side with China. And then, frankly, if another missile comes over Japan or, God forbid, goes anywhere else, you're not then in an issue where you're having to deal with potentially China being allied with North Korea. That for me is a big
Simon,
concern.
The one thing you can be certain of is that both President Trump and Secretary of State Tillerson, they have been working very, very hard with China. Lots of phone calls, lots of things going on. They're doing their utmost to get China to join them and to be very tough with North Korea. Most of the Chinese statements that we've had since Trump made his fire and fury speech, most of them have indicated that they kind of thought the Trump rhetoric at this stage had gone a bit too far, although I do note that overnight the Chinese regime says that that North Korea has reached a tipping point approaching a crisis. So Simon, you're absolutely right that in so many ways China is the absolute key to this, and I do think that the Trump regime are acutely aware of it. Let's hope, Simon, they succeed, and thank you very much indeed for the call. And our next caller is from Moscow. Alex in Moscow. Hello.
Hello.
Hello,
Nigel.
So, what's got to happen next, Alex?
I think this can be a very serious conflict about this. And I would like to ask you about, you put the question, what Trump should do in this situation. But why don't you ask about Kim Jong-un, what he can do in this situation?
Well,
except testing himself and
well, I'm not sure, Alex. I'm not sure, Alex, that when it comes to Kim Jong-un, I'm not sure we're dealing with a rationalist. I mean, that's what worries me. I worry we're dealing with a maniac. Who doesn't actually see logic, and it's almost as if, and it may be right. I mean, a previous caller said they're behaving like children, and it's sort of, the ante is being upped on either side. So I can't presuppose for a moment what the North Koreans are going to do, but it's what the Americans do, perhaps, that interests me. I mean, what do you think they should do?
But if you just for a second think that he would like to protect his country or something like this, what he can do in this situation?
Well, I mean, Trump's been clear. If America's threatened, they're going to respond. End of. And he couldn't back down from that without losing all credibility completely. I guess the question is, and let's assume for a moment that Kim is a rationalist. You know, does he feel threatened by the American presence in South Korea? Perhaps he does. Could there possibly be a compromise of any kind between these two? Alex, I don't know the answer to that, but I suspect that we are in a situation that is going to continue to deteriorate. That is my concern. And of course, the Americans have also been asking the Russian administration to put some very severe trade sanctions on North Korea as well, because there was a bit of worker exchange going on between Russia and between North Korea. Let's see where we go. I thank you very much indeed for that. We're out of time on that. It's a huge debate. It's an issue that is not going to go away in a hurry. I have always taken the view that we're dealing with somebody very dangerous in terms of North Korea, its threat to the world. What they've done to Japan overnight, I think, is pretty worrying and in some ways pretty frightening. Maybe Trump went a little bit far with the rhetoric 2 or 3 weeks ago. We're not headed imminently for a war, but I do think at some point in time we are probably headed for a conflict. I don't say that with any pleasure at all. And coming up next, well, Downing Street has said that the government will not back away from its demand to kick off negotiations on a post-Brexit trade deal as soon as possible. But, of course, Jean-Claude Juncker has slapped it down completely today by saying we need to be crystal clear. We will commence no negotiations on the new relationship over economics and trade between the UK and the EU until all of the other questions are resolved. They want a big divorce bill. They want the future of EU citizens guaranteed. We're at stalemate. What do you think would constitute a sensible compromise? Call me on 0345 60 60 973.
From Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nigel Farage.
Yes, that's right. It's Nigel Farage, and I am standing in for Ian Dale on Drive every day between now and Friday. And the topic for the last hour of the show, yes, it's back to Brexit. That's not because of me, it's because of what's going on out there. And it's been interesting, hasn't it, that so far in these negotiations, it's been Monsieur Barnier chiefly leading for the European Union, making a whole series of demands on us. We have to guarantee what will happen with the Irish border. We have to be clearer about the status of EU citizens living in the United Kingdom. And, of course, there is this huge exit bill that has been, from what I can see, plucked out of the air and kind of presented to us. And the British government, to date, have been saying, yes, we will go along with your negotiating strategy. You ask us to jump and we keep saying how high. But, by the way, at some point, we'd like to talk about the next trade deal. And to do that as part of a package that we can't agree any one thing until the whole package is agreed. And I've noticed over the course of the last 10 days or so that David Davis appears to be getting somewhat impatient. Well, I think he's going to remain impatient because we had Monsieur Barnier yesterday saying that the British negotiations needed to be taken more seriously, done with a tone of condescension that only an upper-class Élysée French bureaucrat could possibly do. And today, yes, it's that man Juncker, back from his summer holidays, saying we need to be crystal clear that we will commence no negotiations on the new relationship, particularly a new economic and trade relationship between the UK and the EU, before all these questions are resolved. So what they're saying is, OK, we're going to buy the house from you. You give us the keys, give us the deeds, and we'll tell you later on what price we're going to pay for it. It simply doesn't work. They're being wholly unreasonable, in my view. In fact, I've said in the past that, frankly, they're behaving like gangsters. Now, that's my view, and I would say that, wouldn't I? I've been there for over 18 years. I've done battle directly. I know all of these individuals, But I do want also for a sensible Brexit deal and one that works in everybody's interest. So, what would compromise a sensible compromise position between the two sides? Let me know what you think. Is it possible at all? Call me on 0345 60 60 973. Where should these negotiations be heading? And if there is to be absolutely no backing down from Barnier or Juncker, does a point come where we simply have to say, I'm very sorry, but we're wasting our time here. We're wasting valuable opportunities that we have with the rest of the world. We're out of here. I don't know. Ben from London Bridge, what do you think would be a sensible position for both sides to take?
Good evening. I think I'm not sure about the European side of things, but for Britain, I think we need to put a very clear message to our counterparts in Europe that we need to look at our strength. We are probably better off without them now that we've made up this decision, and I think there's no reason to feel compromised. Or if we want to do something as a gesture of goodwill, then that's fine. But we shouldn't be obliged. There should be no compulsion to do anything of the sort. And I think before we even go into any discussion or negotiation, we should have a very, very clear stance about how we're going to proceed, and telling them that we're quite better off with them, and hopefully we would do better once we're out of the EU.
Yeah, I mean, Ben, I think we have an incredibly strong negotiating hand because they need us in economic terms very much more than we need them. And we're beginning to hear the voices of Bavarian businesses saying, for goodness sake, do a sensible deal with Britain. We need that market. But the problem, Ben, is, and again, and I'm not going to draw any comparison between the war of words between Trump and North Korea. That's on a whole different level to this. But in a sense, the problem is that I don't think that Juncker and Barnier can be rational about this. Because rationality says, I tell you what, you leave political union, but we will have a simple free trade agreement between us, just as we've got with Canada and several other countries. And given that you're our best marketplace in the world, hey, this all makes sense. The problem is, Ben, the reason we're not dealing with logic is they know if we're seen to leave this club, to run our own lives, to be free to engage with the rest of the world, and to have a sensible trade deal with the EU, their worry is it'll bring the whole house of cards down, because, sort of in a fortnight after we've got that, the Danes will say, we want it, and so on and so forth. And that's the problem, Ben, in my view.
Can I please add something to it, maybe slightly irrelevant, but I think their livelihoods depend on running this EU show. And if Britain leaves, very good livelihoods. Yes, and if Britain leaves and becomes a successful independent country within a matter of months or a few years, and why there is no reason then Spain and France and Italy and whoever would want to do the same thing, if they become slightly more flexible with Britain when it comes to the negotiation, they would have to face more consequences dealing with these countries as well. The EU would collapse anyways once the Britain is out of it. I think they're just trying to extend themselves onto the life support for as long as they can.
Well, Ben, you've got to understand, Ben. You've got to understand, Ben, that for a lot of these people in Brussels, it's a very nice, comfortable, good lifestyle. Long holidays, great packages, top rate of tax of 16%, great pensions, and an endless number of cocktail parties to go to and fun things to do. So it's a great lifestyle. Ben, tell me, how did you vote in the referendum last year?
I voted to remain.
Yep.
Because I was off the... I'm still, if we go rewind, I'm still of the opinion it is a better thing for countries to stick together for, many reasons. But I'm also of the opinion that once you've taken a decision, I respect the decision of everybody or rather the majority to leave out, I think that Britain is in a very, very good position to tell the whole world and the EU that we can survive. I think we don't need to feel worried about what's going to happen to EU. And if, like I said in the beginning, if we want to do anything, it should just be a matter of goodwill. Once we're out of it, we shouldn't be responsible for anything else. Asking us to pay this huge amount of money is simply ridiculous. I think it's outrageous.
Very interesting, great argument, and somebody there, folks, who was a Remainer but accepts the result and says, let's make the best of it and recognise we're not in a bad place. Steve says to me on Twitter, Mr Farage, what on earth will we talk and tweet about and argue about once Brexit is over? Steve, I have a feeling this is going to go on for a very long time. Walk away. Then the leaders of the other EU countries can tell their businesses why they can't export to the UK without huge tariffs. I get that on Twitter. Well, yeah, it is a point of view. It is a point of view that we actually have a very strong hand indeed. Tim from Chesterfield, what would a sensible compromise be in your opinion?
A sensible compromise
or is it not possible?
A sensible, because of course it depends what side you sit on, isn't it? If I went to my bank and said, this bond that I signed up for, that the bank said would offer me so and so interest in a certain number of years, well, I've decided I think I'm going to cancel it and I'm going to take my money. And if there are terms and conditions, you can whistle. If I said that to my bank and I'm going to take my money, they'd say, hang on a minute, there's terms and conditions here. What makes you think that Britain is such a special case that we can just walk away? Why is Britain so special that we can walk away?
Oh, Tim, with political will, we can do what the hell we like. Of course we can walk away. Of course we can walk away. The question is that the right thing to do? And let me surprise you, Tim.
Nigel, have you no idea how stupid this is making Britain look?
I know. The idea that we become...
This is making Britain look.
What, the idea that we become an independent democratic nation like 200 states in the world?
We've been made to look like total idiots.
What, we should be governed by Mr Juncker, you mean?
There are terms and conditions.
Right, OK, Tim, let's deal with those terms and... Right, fine, listen. By the way, Tim, let me surprise you here. I am actually not at this stage suggesting we get up, stick two fingers up and say to hell with you. I'm not suggesting that. And I think there is a compromise, and it's this. Article 50 makes clear, once we've concluded whatever it is, we have no further obligations. However, the EU has a spending round that lasts for a 7-year cycle. And this particular spending round goes on until the middle of 2020. And we signed up to that. I mean, I didn't vote for it, but we signed up to that a few years ago. And I think we should honour that. And that, to me, is the compromise. The compromise is that, yes, we will meet our legal obligations up until the middle of 2020. But, Tim, what is utterly bizarre is the concept that Monsieur Barnier or somebody is going to pluck a figure out of the air like 50 billion euros that we owe them. And that is just, frankly, plain unreasonable in my view.
Can I just say, Nigel, I appreciate people with a strong will and an independent mind, and you've done a heck of a lot to represent somebody with a strong will. You've gone through plane crashes, you've gone through personal... Well, I don't want to sort of pry, but you've gone through a lot personally to be where you are today. And I've got to respect that. But please, you will struggle to find a UKIP voter or most people who voted out that could quote that point that you've made about the spending terms. Because then they're concerned about going back to the 1950s and Britain being great again, and good grief, this is a fantasy.
Tim, you will always get, on both sides of the argument, people supporting the argument making views that you may not necessarily agree with. Let me promise you this, Tim. I believed in Brexit because I believe in the independence, democracy, self-government of our nation, and I also believe that in the 21st century, if we're going to be successful, we've got to go global. and I think the EU was really seriously holding us back. But, Tim, I just said, I'm prepared to compromise and meet our obligations up to the middle of 2020, and then I would feel, you know, we'd more than met our responsibilities. Do you think that constitutes a reasonable compromise?
You know what? I think it does, but we don't hear it. We don't hear it.
Right. Well, Tim, let me promise you, you'll hear it from me. I'm going to be as reasonable as I can about this. We're not going back to the 1950s. We're heading forward into the 21st century global economy. Tim from Chesterfield, thank you very much indeed. OK, the time now is 6:15. The Brexit Secretary, David Davis, is saying, come on, guys, let's talk about a future trade relationship as part of this renegotiation package, but I'm afraid that Monsieur Barnier and Juncker have shot back and said, no, we're not talking about trade, we're not talking about a future relationship until first you agree to pay us a bill, tell us what will happen with the Northern Irish border and the rights of EU citizens. And I'm asking you, what would constitute a sensible compromise between the two positions, or is one simply not possible at all? Let me know what you think on 0345 60 60 973, text 84850, tweet at LBC, using the hashtag Farage on LBC. Let me know what you think. JP from Cornwall sends me a very interesting text. He says, have I missed something here? If the EU has given us the bill, how much is it? And is it itemised? Well, JP, is very interesting. So the speculation began that it was going to be 50 billion euros. And I was in the European Parliament, and Barnier was sitting there just a few feet from me, sitting next to Juncker. And I said, you know, is this 50 billion figure right? If it is, can you tell me how you arrived at that figure? Have you not simply plucked it out of the air? He said nothing. And a week or two went by, and the Financial Times, always helpful, the Financial Times, or, you know, wanted us to join the euro, wanted us to remain, supported the exchange rate mechanism 25 years ago. And the Financial Times said it could be 100 billion. And I asked the same question again of Barnier. He said, no, it won't be 100 billion euros. So at least we know that. No, there's been no itemisation whatsoever, and frankly, I've sort of equated it, JP, to it's rather like a ransom. They're treating us like we're a hostage. We're not a hostage. We're free to go. We're free simply to walk away. I don't want it to come to that, but unless they're prepared to compromise, then I just don't see quite what David Davis can do. I wonder whether Herbie in Harrow has got the solution.
You are joking, Nigel. These people don't see you, they don't hear you, they don't even talk to you. You know, all they do is keep coming up with demands. Demands that are, you know, not rational. They are completely out of touch. They really don't care. They've got their own agenda, and I'm afraid we don't come into that agenda. And you know that as well as I do. We're not going to win the day. They're going to make it very difficult for us.
Well, they are making it incredibly difficult. I mean, you know, they are repeatedly saying that everything must be done on their terms. And actually, David Davis and the British government to date have been pretty blimmin' reasonable. I mean, more than reasonable. We've been incredibly generous so far in all of this. I think believing, Herbie, that logic says that a sensible trade agreement is so much in their interest. But I worry that what Barnier and Juncker are doing is defending the political project of the EU. They fear it crumbling. So, Herbie, you think they're totally unreasonable. And it's interesting that Mr. Varoufakis, who was the Greek finance minister, wrote a book about this and said, you know, you can't negotiate with this lot. What would you do then, Herbie? Would you simply walk away? Or, I mean, what would you do if you were David Davis right now? What would you do?
I would say I want my P45 now. Thank you very much. You know, you've had more than enough from us. We bought the assets of the EU over the years. You know, does that come into the equation? It doesn't appear to. And I mean to say, what more and how much more do they want from us? As you just said earlier, where's the breakdown? I did ask that earlier on in the week. Where's the breakdown of what this 50 billion amounts to?
Well, Herbie, In my reasonableness, I'm saying we should meet our obligations up until the middle of 2020. The bit I didn't add...
You're too kind, Nigel.
I know everyone's been saying that for years. But also, Herbie, I would like some rationalisation of what our assets are. because we have money in the European Investment Bank Central. I mean, we've got money in this thing. So we'll meet our obligations of what we owe to the middle of 2020, but could they please tell us what our shares are worth? Wouldn't that be nice?
Exactly, Nigel. So we know if we get on a level footing, then perhaps we might be able to negotiate a better deal. But as I said earlier, they don't see us, they don't talk to us, they don't hear us. And when you got that, when you got deaf heads and everything else, what do you expect, Nigel? They really don't care. They got their own agenda, and as I said, we do not come into that agenda at all. It's their own game. They're playing their game, not ours.
Herbie, thank you. Herbie from Harrow there, very pessimistic about the direction that all of this is going in. Kevin from Doncaster, perhaps you have the solution, the compromise that is needed to bring the two sides together.
Hello, Nigel Farage, my hero.
Oh, hello, right.
My hero. And millions of other British people. Nigel, what you did in 2016 it was a miracle.
I must admit, some days I still think, gosh, did we really win that? Because beating the establishment is not easy. But the position the government now finds itself in, and, you know, David Davis is the Brexit negotiator, Kevin, and I shared platforms with him, you know, all over the north of England and elsewhere, so I know that he's sincere in wanting us to get Brexit on the right terms. But is there a sensible compromise, Kevin, we can reach with these people, or frankly, is it going to prove impossible?
I think if the likes of Bill Cash and Jacob Rees-Mogg and yourself was in charge, we would have left by now on a really good deal.
So is this because the British government are frankly Remainers who are not strong enough in these negotiations? Or, I mean, what's your view on that?
Well, Mrs May is a Remainer. I don't think she's strong enough. I don't really know about David Davis. He doesn't look strong enough now that he's coming up against the top people in the EU. We need someone like you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, people like that who, you know, are going to back this country to get where it...
Well, the thing is, Kevin, I'm certainly not there. And Jacob may be sitting on the back benches, but I don't think he's anywhere near the front benches at this moment in time. So we've got what we've got. Does a point come, Kevin, where we simply have to walk away, in your view?
Well, like you said, we've got to look at the assets that we gave. We gave a lot of money towards the European Union, and we have to look at, you know, where that money was spent, and does it owe us any money?
Well, I think that's right, and I think that should be assessed. I mean, maybe we own a share in all the buildings because they're assets, and we've certainly got some money in the banks and investment vehicles. Kevin, are you optimistic, as a Brexit voter, are you optimistic that it's still going to happen, though?
We've triggered the Article 50. We're three-quarters of the way down there. We're not going back.
Yep.
You know, we will be leaving the European Union.
Absolutely. And Kevin, later on, after this show, do you know what? I'll drink to that. And thank you very much indeed for your call. The EU Commission can't be negotiated with. It's virtually a waste of time. David Davis has an uphill struggle to get anything sensible from these obstinate functionaries, says Richard in Chelsea. Well, it certainly isn't easy, because they're not being very logical. John from Malvern, what do you think?
Good evening. Good to speak to you.
Good evening.
First point, I believe Barnier and Juncker will continue the process ad infinitum. They don't want us to leave. They're frightened to death regarding the money that won't come into their coffers. And the first part of the process of our politicians to fall apart is this business with Keir Starmer and the Labour Party. I just cannot believe, after 3 months from their manifesto...
Oh, I know.
...how they've changed it. It's just beyond my comprehension.
John, and we debated this. I debated this between 7 and 8 last night, and it was very difficult to find anybody, particularly Labour voters, supporting this complete 180 that they've done over the course of the weekend. But, John, tell me, do you think it's possible that we can reach a reasonable compromise in Brussels with Barnier and Juncker, or are we just barking up the wrong tree?
I would love to think we could, but I think at the moment, with their attitude, we're barking up the wrong tree. And therefore, that brings me to my second point.
Yep.
I think we should set a deadline. I think whatever that deadline is in terms of the date, should be considered closely to say, if you are not really going to sit down and negotiate properly and come to a sensible agreement, that suits both European manufacturers, English manufacturers, trade, etc., then what's the point of all this?
Well,
and then the third point...
John, John, 2 points is all I can give you, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually Article 50 was supposed to be the deadline, and now we're talking about transitional arrangements going on for goodness knows how long. John from Malvern, I thank you for your call and your 2 points. I want to hear from you. Tell me that the EU are being reasonable. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me we need to bend and give them everything they want before we can even start to discuss trade. Call me on 0345 6060 973. Tell me what that compromise is. I'm Nigel Farage here on LBC. It's 6:30. Well, before we go back to your calls on Brexit and what a compromise with the EU would look like, if indeed it's possible at all, let's get a business update with Justin Urquhart-Stewart from 7 Investment Management. Good evening, Justin.
Hello, Nigel.
Now tell me, the Aberdeen-based brewer Brewdog, what are they up to?
Brewdog, this is a wonderful sort of brewery because it started off, it was actually given a £20,000 bank loan back in 2007, and 2 guys from Aberdeen have now built this business up, so it's now worth £1 billion.
Wow.
It's quite astonishing.
Wow.
And it's a slightly it's not retro, it's sort of almost a punk bars they run. They look sort of slightly tatty from the outside, and they've got some great brands. They have Punk IPA, Sink the Bismarck. I mean, nothing...
Sounds like my kind of thing.
Suitable PC stuff. And it's actually proved very popular indeed. Anyway, given today with all the idea about corporate behaviour and what we should be doing, it's interesting to see that their plan is of their profits, 20% will be given away each year. 10% of all profits will go directly to its working team, everybody there, and 10% will go to charity. And that's they put down as a sort of standard blueprint for their business. No other business I've seen has ever done something like this and come out with that sort of structure. And given the fact that we're talking about the possibility of people represented, workers represented on boards and things like that, as you've been talking about before, this is actually a company saying, front foot forward, look, we put our customers and our staff first, that's what we should be doing, and the company should be seen to be doing the right thing.
So a lot of very happy workers, I'd have thought.
I would have thought so.
Brewdog this evening. Now that's very, very interesting. And tell me, would have, I mean, you said 2007, they got a £20,000 loan from the bank. Would a couple of guys with an idea to set up a brewery that went to one of our high street banks today, would they get that loan?
I doubt it very much indeed. I find it wonderful. In those days, you could do it. We need more mechanisms in this country to raise capital for entrepreneurial businesses like this.
I have to say, I think it's a major problem. And of course, as you know, Justin, I spent 20 years... I had a proper job like you. I spent 20 years in the metals business. And I must say I have been looking and talking about the gold price for a very, very long time. Now, as a result of the overnight Korean missile going over Japan, there have been a few buyers for gold, I understand.
There have indeed. And if you actually just go back over the past few weeks, remember we had that little bit of nerves with Trump and Korea about a fortnight ago. We saw it going up then. If we go back over all 3 months, it's gone up 6%, about 12% for the year to date. But today, 2.8%, taking it up over $1,300 an ounce. We saw that around about this time last year, so $1,323 for that. But bear in mind, gold's a perfectly good investment. It goes up and down, but it doesn't give you any income.
I know.
So, for investors, you've got to be really careful indeed.
Yeah, there's no dividend yield or anything like that from gold. No, I understand that. And, of course, the argument against gold used to be that, of course, you can always have your money on current account earning interest, but that doesn't apply anymore,
That doesn't apply, no. You have to work very hard to try and find anything out of that. And even then, if you do get interest on it, of any size at all, it's still lower than the rate of inflation. These are negative interest rates, which is really sad for many people, because more people save in this country than borrow, and those older people who've got savings, they're the ones who've been hardest hit over the past few years.
It's been a very tough decade and more for them. And finally, how the markets ended today?
FTSE 100 still feeling a little bit depressed, down 63 today. That's at 7,337. And as for the currencies, against the dollar, absolutely flat. But the euro is getting stronger, and now euro against the pound, 107. So down from 110. Really quite dramatic move on that one.
Very good for European tourists coming to London, but not so good the other way around. Thank you very much indeed, Justin. That was Justin Urquhart-Stewart from 7 Investment Management.
This is LBC with Nigel Farage.
Now, I'm asking you, what constitutes a sensible compromise with Monsieur Barnier and Monsieur Juncker? Because they're telling us they won't even discuss future trade relationships until we agree first to all of their terms. What constitutes a sensible compromise? Or is it perhaps simply not possible at all? Let me know what you think on 0345 6060 973. And I'm going to Heathrow next to Murad. Good evening.
Hello, good evening, Mr. Farage. First time calling your show?
Well, you're very welcome. It's not my show, it's Ian Dale's show, to be honest with you, but I know what you mean, and you're very welcome. Now, tell me something. Is a sensible compromise possible with these people?
I'm slightly dubious whether that is actually possible or not. I think in any art of any negotiation, you have to, when you step into the negotiation, you have to be prepared to walk away. And the other side needs to know that you are capable of doing so. Because at the moment, I mean, it could be as simple as buying a pair of shoes or walking out of the European Union, it's still a play. You have to be able to walk up there and say, right, these are our terms, try and negotiate a reasonable one. And I don't mean, like you say, plucking up a figure, whatever they want, 50 billion, 60 billion. It needs to be a reasonable one, meet our obligations, financial obligations, but then no more. As soon as they start, stepping out of line, asking for unreasonable things, then we need to show them that we can walk away, and we're prepared to do so.
You could argue
the only way for us to get any result.
I mean, you're absolutely right that any business negotiation, the other side have to know that if you're not happy, you're walking. I understand that completely. The trouble is, I think the EU have started off on such an unreasonable footing, haven't they?
Well, that's right. I mean, and I think that's what they're doing. They're trying to feel us out. They're trying to see what we are going to do about it. And how we react is very important, because that sets the tone for the remainder of the negotiations. And if if they're making demands, then we need to be making equally, extravagant demands to show that we are not going to be pushed around. Because if we do that, we have lost before we even started. And that is the base for any negotiation. And I think, it's just unreasonable for them to come over and say, even the tone of how they're talking, they are the bosses of the negotiation. They're the ones in control.
Oh, yes. Oh, they are the masters of Europe, Murad. These are the bosses of 500 million people and all the power and trappings that go with it. And doesn't it just show in these negotiations? And I must say, I thought Barnier yesterday was incredibly haughty. I mean, frankly, just looking down his nose at us. Murad, were you a Leave voter or a Remain voter?
I was a Remain voter, but nevertheless, I don't like people, trying to take the mick out of me and trying to, abuse their position, and I don't like that. And quite frankly, more and more, if I have the same thing, same goal at the referendum, I'll be voting the other way.
Interesting.
Because I think they're unreasonable.
Yeah, no, but do you know what? Very difficult to argue with anything you've just said there. First time caller, Murad from Heathrow, thank you very much indeed. Interesting, isn't it? Two of the strongest arguments we've had tonight for how these negotiations should go and why we should stand up for ourselves against unreasonable behaviour have come from Remain voters. This idea that gets put out so often in parts of the media, both written media, and indeed some television media, that somehow all Remain voters are furious. They feel the future of the nation has been betrayed, could not be further from the truth. Elizabeth in Shrewsbury, what compromise would you put on the table if you were in David Davis's position?
None.
None.
And no, and as I said to your researcher, the main reason is this. Audited accounts from any company have to be put forward in law if you are going into any negotiation for either increasing or decreasing your business.
Yep.
How long has it been, because you've got more knowledge than I have, since the EU produced legal audited accounts?
Oh, I think you're being a bit harsh on the EU, Elizabeth. I mean, it's only been 20 years.
Right.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yes, I thought it was 22. So we are now in a basis where they're presenting a bill to this great country, and there is no legal basis whatsoever. They have plucked a figure out of the air.
Oh, yes.
Now, of course, this is now, as I said to your researcher, a dangerous situation. The Labour Party are telling the British people that they are going to ignore the Brexit vote, which is akin to communism, which links in with John McDonnell standing up in Parliament and showing the little red book in our House of Commons.
That may or may not be the case, Elizabeth, but what is for certain is that Corbyn and McDonnell this week have allowed themselves, by pressure from their own backbenches, to effectively join Juncker and Barnier in trying to make life as difficult as possible for this government. And given that this government, Elizabeth, is putting into place the will of the people as expressed in a referendum, I, like you, take a very dim view. Elizabeth, thank you. Rather backing her up, Graham says to me on text, we should stand firm and call the bluff of these blackmailers. We should not give in to bullies. Juncker and co are deliberately causing uncertainty to try and keep the creaky EU edifice together. Well, that's a point of view. I'm Nigel Farage, here on LBC. It's 6:45. Well, an hour ago I said that Donald Trump had landed in Corpus Christi in Texas, and since then he's been addressing the press. So let's get more on this from Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent. Simon, good afternoon.
Good evening to you, Nigel. Donald Trump very much in Texas at this hour.
And this, no doubt, because he did not want to be seen to be like President Bush from Katrina 13 years ago. He wants to sort of get there and roll his sleeves up effectively.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, you know, historically speaking, Hurricane Katrina was obviously the point at which every future American president realized how not to handle a hurricane. Yes. George W. Bush, of course, excoriated for his handling of that storm. And President Trump has been telling reporters that he wants people to look going forward in 5, 10, 15 years at the way in which the authorities in Texas and the federal government here in Washington reacted to Hurricane Harvey as the new textbook for how you go about doing this. He was very calibrated in his comments down in Texas over the course of the last hour, mostly leaving the talking to Governor Greg Abbott of Texas and some of the other officials there who have been leading the rescue and recovery efforts. He made it very clear that he believes that those efforts have been largely successful, but he said, look, I'm not going to offer congratulations because we're not doing congratulations on an event like this. Perhaps when it's all over, we will be able to congratulate one another. And it is by no means over, Nigel. You've got the death toll in Texas now at 12. One of the dams in Houston has spilled over at least a little bit for the first time after record rainfall has hit that particular city. And there are now concerns not just about what happens in South Texas, there are concerns about Louisiana and New Orleans, which of course was in the eye of Hurricane Katrina back on George W. Bush's watch. This storm is now beginning to dump substantial amounts of rain on New Orleans and on Lake Charles in Louisiana, and everybody here in Washington is worried about that becoming another possible second front as the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey continues to spill through the south of the United States.
Yeah, no, horrible. And does Trump now stay in Texas, or is it back to the White House? How's he going to play this?
Well, very interesting. He's coming back to Washington after receiving the briefings that he's getting in Corpus Christi and meeting some of the people who have been dealing with the situation there. But the White House has already told reporters he will be returning to Texas this weekend, we believe on Saturday. And look, I think there's no question that from a political perspective, President Trump is eager to continue demonstrating that the plight of those people in Texas, perhaps also in Louisiana, who have been so caught up in this dreadful storm, is absolutely uppermost in his mind. And by returning there this coming weekend, he'll have a further opportunity to keep the headlines focused on his government's response to this storm, which for him will be a very welcome break from the headlines that otherwise might be dominating the news cycle, because headlines are continuing to be made here about the Russia investigation.
Yes, and there are plenty of those. Simon, thank you very much indeed, and keep us in touch over the course of this week. That was Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent, making the point that a dam is beginning to overflow. We heard that levees were breaking on rivers earlier, and that this situation in the States is far, far, far from over. Now, before the break, we had a caller in Elizabeth, and we had a texter in Graham, who were basically of the view that we're dealing with wholly unreasonable people in the shape of Barnier and, of course, Mr. Juncker. That's one side of the argument, but look, tell me that they're wrong. Tell me I'm wrong. I mean, tell me actually the EU are being absolutely reasonable and we should do everything they say before we even discuss trade. I'd be very happy to hear if there are people out there that believe that. Call me, perhaps Bob Geldof, someone like that, I don't know. Call me on 0345 60 60 973. Meanwhile, we go to Paul in Skipton. Paul, is there a reasonable compromise that can be struck here?
Well, it's difficult. And first of all, I'd like to say, no, you're not wrong, and those other two callers weren't wrong either. But there's two parts to this, isn't there? There's the budget that Cameron committed us to for 2020.
Yes.
And then there's whatever figure that they believe we should be paying. Now, if we start with the budget, I've tried as much as I can to find out what that is. I mean, if you think about it,
So have I, Paul. So have I.
A budget means there's a total, doesn't it? You know, like in any accounts, yeah? There is a grand total, and we are committed to paying a percentage of that.
Yep.
So surely somebody knows what that figure is. So that's the starting point. What is that figure?
Well,
you know, and then we can agree to pay that till 2020. But with the second part of it, where they claim that we owe them some money, well, they've got to justify. If they feel we owe them money, they've got to prove it. And as Elizabeth said earlier, they can't even audit their own accounts. So they certainly can't approve this figure, or they certainly, you know, in some ways they're not capable of doing so. And I bet you Davis has gone to them and gone toe-to-toe and says, OK, you want that figure, tell me how you arrived at that figure. And they simply can't. So what do? They say, well, you, Britain, have got to come up with a mechanism for arriving at the figure. You know, this is absolutely ridiculous. So until sensibility actually happens, how can we compromise or do anything?
I mean, what David Davis is doing, I'm sure, and he will know, of course, the figures that they're talking about. What David Davis is trying to do, sensibly, I guess, is to pull all the strings together in one. And so that we have an overall package that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, which is the kind of position that the UK government has taken. And that's reasonable, Paul. My worry is we spend up to 2 years on this negotiation. At the end of it, we might either get nowhere or the European Parliament, of course, could veto the whole shooting match. And that's what really worries me, is are we wasting years of our lives? Are we effectively not getting on with our global mission, tying ourselves up in something? And I just worry, do Juncker and Barnier and people like that charming Mr Verhofstadt in the European Parliament, do they actually want this to fail because they feel it's their job to hold this project together?
Well, these people live in a bubble, as you well know. They're not really attuned to their own voters. Now, most of their voters, certainly in the Parliament, only in the Parliament, should I say, are German car workers, French winemakers, etc., etc.
Oh, yes.
So are they going to sacrifice their jobs for the greater good of the EU project?
There's not one of them.
When it comes to,
There's not one of them, Paul, that I want to. And you know, this idea that it's just the silly old Brits that are Eurosceptic, I promise you, you travel around France, you meet exactly the same division of opinion on this as you do in this country. No, absolutely, and I totally agree with that, Paul. Paul, I thank you very much. My last caller, I've quickly got time for Morris in Edgware. What about a compromise, Morris? Is it possible?
Good evening, Nigel. Well, what I wanted to say was we keep on hearing about Mr Davis, Mr Barnier, Mr Juncker and the EU, but they don't run businesses. And companies in Europe, companies here, depend on each other to trade. And it's about time that all the business people turn round to the EU and say, blow you lot, we're doing what we want to do. We don't, you depend on us for business. We don't depend on you to run our businesses.
Do you know what, Morris?
Completely.
Do you know what? I'd love to hear that voice, but all I get are the CBI and the people that have always supported the project and supported us joining the Euro. And I agree with you, Morris. We not only need the voice of business, we can also do, I think, with a few businessmen helping in those negotiations. Morris, I've got to end it there because that's me done for today. Thank you for your company. Yes, I'm back again tomorrow at 4 p.m. on Drive, standing in for Ian Dale. Coming up at 10 tonight, it's Ian Collins. But leading Britain's conversation next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you. Lots to come between now and 10. At 9, it's the Health Hour and Dr. Snay Kempker.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.